The blizzard descended upon Timberline Pass with the fury of an ancient god unleashed each snowflake. A crystalline blade driven by winds that shrieked through the granite peaks with wind knifed the rock and erased tracks within minutes. February 15th, 1878, had dawned deceptively clear in the Colorado Territory, painting the high country in shades of gold and promise. But by afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, pregnant with the kind of violence that only the mountains could deliver with such pitiless precision. Elise Hardin pressed her spine against the merciless stone of Devil's Tooth Ridge, her entire body convulsing with exhaustion that had carved itself into her very bones. The labor had stolen everything from her strength, hope, and nearly her life. 3 endless days had passed since the first contraction struck like lightning in her lower back, and now with her premature son barely breathing in her arms, death seemed as inevitable as the next gust of wind that clawed at their exposed position. Her fingers were numb beyond all feeling as she traced the baby's tiny face with desperate tenderness, searching for the whisper of breath that would tell her he still fought against the cold, trying to claim him. His skin was translucent as parchment, so pale she could see the delicate tracery of blue veins beneath like a roadmap of his fragile hold on life. Born too early, too small, too fragile for this brutal world, yet still fighting with a determination that broke her heart and rebuilt it in the same devastating moment. The Carson Valley wagon train had abandoned her at first light when the contractions began, the wagon master's wife crossing herself and muttering about dark omens that followed premature births like shadows. Early babies bring death to the healthy ones. Martha Kellerman had declared, her voice carrying the cold authority of frontier superstition reinforced by bitter experience, and the kind of fear that made survival trump compassion. The Lord's will be done, but not in my company where it might spread to the living. The Lord's will. Elise almost laughed at the cruel irony, but even that small effort was beyond her failing strength. What kind of divine plan condemned an innocent child to freeze before he had even drawn his first full breath? Her son nameless, because she had never imagined needing to choose a name so soon, had never prepared for life to arrive. With such desperate urgency lay silent against her chest, his tiny lips the color of winter twilight. Jack was gone, vanished like smoke into the gambling halls and brothels of Central City 6 weeks before the baby arrived, chasing dreams of easy money, while leaving behind nothing but mounting debts and a reputation as worthless as a Confederate dollar. The last she had heard, he was calling himself Whispering Fox around the mining camps, as if a foolish nickname could transform a weak man into something dangerous, and respected something more than the frightened boy who had fled when responsibility came calling. Conrad Voss, the silver baron who owned half the mountainside and most of the souls who worked it, had made his intentions crystal clear through Deputy Tate's visit 2 days past. Jack's gambling debts had grown beyond his ability to pay, and the Quicksilver Mining Company would accept alternative arrangements. Elise and her unborn child were now company assets, human property to be collected when convenient and put to whatever use would best serve the balance sheets. She had chosen the mountains instead of Voss's company quarters, preferring honest death to dishonest life. Even now, with the cold creeping through her veins, like ice water seeking her heart, she knew it had been the right choice. Better to die free in the wilderness than live as chattel in a mining camp brothel where her body would be sold nightly to pay her husband's debts, where her child would grow up knowing his mother as a commodity rather than a person. The baby stirred weakly against her breast, his breath coming in tiny puffs that barely disturbed the frigid air. Each exhale might be his last, and she found herself counting them like a miser counts coins, hoarding each precious sign of life as if her attention alone could keep his spirit from departing. She had never imagined love could be so fierce and so helpless, at the same time a burning in her chest that defied the cold trying to claim them both. "I'm sorry, little one." She whispered, her words lost in the wind's howl. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall tiny crystals of grief that would outlast her warmth. I should have been stronger. Should have found a way to protect you from this world that has no place for the weak or the unwanted. Her eyelids grew heavy as the cold seeped deeper into her core, numbing her extremities before beginning its slow, methodical advance toward her heart. Perhaps it would be merciful now, she thought with the strange clarity that sometimes came in extremity. Perhaps they would simply slip away together, mother and child, into the white peace that waited beyond pain and fear, and the endless struggle to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush the tender and the hopeful. The sound of boots crunching through snow came like a drumbeat through her fading consciousness, rhythmic and deliberate against the storm's chaotic symphony. Elise forced her eyes open, her body tensing with the last desperate energy of a cornered animal. Through the swirling curtain of snow emerged a figure that seemed born from the storm itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of a predator despite the treacherous footing and blinding conditions. The man was unmistakably Lakota, his coal-black hair hanging in twin braids past powerful shoulders, wrapped in a magnificent buffalo robe that seemed to absorb the storm's fury and transform it into something protective rather than threatening. His face was carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves, weathered by sun and wind into something both beautiful and terrible, with high cheekbones that caught the dim light and a mouth set in a line that spoke of determination rather than cruelty. But it was his eyes that held her captive, dark as midnight, but burning with an inner fire that spoke of intelligence loss and something else she couldn't name. Compassion, perhaps, or recognition of his own brush with mortality in this unforgiving wilderness where death and life walked hand in hand like old companions. He was everything she had been taught to fear from childhood, a savage. Her people would have called him one of the hostiles who raided settlements and stole children in the night. Every story she had ever heard, every warning whispered around frontier hearths should have made her shrink from his approach. Yet as he knelt beside her without speaking, those remarkable eyes taking in her condition and the bundle in her arms with a single comprehensive glance that missed nothing, she felt only hope blooming in her chest, like an unexpected flower in winter. From a beaded medicine pouch at his belt, he withdrew dry pine pitch and kindling, building a small fire, with movements as sure and practiced as breathing. His hands worked with economical efficiency, each motion serving multiple purposes as he created shelter from wind and hope from despair. The warrior's scarred fingers showed the marks of hard-living old cuts from blades and tools, burns from forges or campfires, and what looked like the puckered scar of a bullet wound on his left wrist, pink and raised against his dark skin. The flames caught despite the howling wind, sheltered by his body and the stone overhang above them. Orange light danced across the granite walls, transforming the death trap of the ridge into something approaching sanctuary. The sudden warmth on her face felt like a resurrection, like the first breath after drowning. Before Elise could protest or even fully comprehend what was happening, the warrior had lifted her son from her trembling arms. Panic flared in her chest as she watched him open his buffalo robe and press the child against his bare chest, his dark skin radiating heat like a living furnace. The trust required in that moment, allowing a stranger to take her dying child, went against every maternal instinct, yet something in his manner, in the infinite care with which he handled the tiny bundle, convinced her that this was not surrender, but salvation. The baby's cry, thin and reedy but unmistakably alive, cut through the storm like a blade through silk. The sound sent a jolt of pure relief through Elise's heart, followed immediately by a rush of gratitude so intense it brought fresh tears that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. "Breathe, woman," the warrior commanded in accented English, his voice deep and steady as distant thunder rolling across summer plains. He repositioned himself so the fire warmed both mother and child, his powerful frame serving as a windbreak against the mountain's assault. Your son fights the cold. You must fight too. The words carried authority that brooked no argument, the kind of voice that had commanded warriors in battle and led hunting parties through hostile territory. Yet beneath the command was something gentler, encouragement, perhaps, or simple recognition of her struggle. Elise drew a shuddering breath, and then another, her body responding to the quiet authority in his voice. She watched in wonder as color began to return to her baby's face, his tiny fists unclenching as warmth drove back death's invasion. The transformation was miraculous, from the gray pallor of approaching death to the pink flush of renewed life, as if she were watching a flower bloom in fast motion. "Thank you." She managed, her voice cracking like ice breaking on a spring creek. I thought we were going to die." The warrior's dark eyes met hers across the fire's glow, and she saw something flicker in those depths, pain perhaps, or recognition of his own losses to the mountain's cruelty. Lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into countless sunrises, of watching horizons for threats that might never come or might arrive with devastating suddenness. "Death comes when it comes," he said simply, adjusting his hold on the infant with infinite care. "Today is not that day." He settled back on his heels while keeping the child secure against his chest, tending the fire with one hand while the other supported the tiny bundle. Every movement spoke of experience with fragile things, a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his warrior's bearing, but felt completely natural nonetheless. "I am Tasunke," he said, his pronunciation making the name sound like music carried on the wind. "It means horse in your tongue. You have names Elise." She replied, surprised by how natural it felt to share this intimacy with a stranger who had become her salvation. The simple exchange felt like a ritual, a formal acknowledgement of their shared humanity in this place, where death lurked just beyond the fire's reach. "The baby? I thought there would be more time to choose." Tasunke nodded, as if he understood perfectly. In his world, she realized children probably received their names through ceremony and celebration, surrounded by family and community, rather than in desperate moments balanced between life and death. "Names come when the spirit is ready," he said gently. "Tonight, staying alive is enough." The baby had begun to root against Tasunke's chest, his survival instinct stronger than his fear of the unfamiliar. The warrior handed him back to Elise with infinite care, watching as she guided the child to her breast. The infant latched on immediately, nursing with a vigor that made her heart soar with hope for the first time in what felt like years. As the three of them huddled together through the endless night, feeding the fire and sharing the profound silence that comes when words become inadequate to express the weight of the moment, Elise felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. She was no longer alone. This stranger had chosen to save them, asking nothing in return except that they continue breathing, continue fighting, continue existing in a world that seemed determined to snuff out their small flame of life. The storm raged around their small sanctuary with undiminished fury, but within the circle of firelight, warmth and safety reigned. Tasunke tended the flames with practiced skill, feeding them just enough fuel to maintain heat, without creating smoke that might betray their location to anyone foolish enough to be traveling in such weather. His presence was a constant reassurance, solid and dependable as the mountains themselves. When dawn finally broke clear and bitter over the eastern peaks on February 16th, revealing a landscape transformed by the storm's artistry into something alien and beautiful, Elise realized that her son's first full day of life had also been her own rebirth. She was no longer the abandoned wife of a worthless gambler, no longer the frightened woman who had nearly surrendered to despair. She was a mother, and she had found someone willing to help her fight for that precious title. The morning air cut like crystal through their lungs as Tasunke prepared for travel, his movements economical and purposeful. His pinto pony stood patient in the lee of a boulder, its thick winter coat frosted with ice crystals, but its eyes alert and intelligent. The animal clearly trusted its master, completely responding to subtle hand signals rather than voice commands that might carry too far in the thin air and alert potential threats to their presence. Elise struggled to stand, her body protesting after the long night on frozen ground. Her calico dress had stiffened into a shell of ice, crackling with each movement like breaking eggshells. Every muscle ached from the combination of childbirth and exposure, but the baby seemed remarkably improved, nursing with renewed strength and regarding the brilliant white world with dark eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. "He's stronger," she observed, marveling at the transformation a single night of warmth had wrought in her child. "Mountain air makes the blood run clean," Tasunke replied, warming smooth river stones in the fire's coals with the patience of someone who understood that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in this country led to death. "If it doesn't kill you first." He showed her how to wrap the heated stones in soft doe skin and tuck them around the baby's body for portable warmth, his scarred hands infinitely gentle when touching the infant. Those hands told stories, written in flesh, calloused from weapon use and tool work, marked by old wounds that spoke of violence survived and hardship endured, but capable of the most delicate care when fragile life hung in the balance. "You know, children," she said, watching him adjust the warming stones with practiced precision that spoke of experience rather than mere instinct. Something shadow-dark passed across Tasunke's features, pain flickering in his eyes like lightning behind storm clouds. The lines around his mouth deepened, and for a moment, he looked older than his years. "Had a nephew," he replied, his voice carefully controlled in the way of men who had learned to carry grief without letting it destroy them. "Moppy's boy, my brother's son. Would have been about this age if the soldiers hadn't come to Crow Wing Creek last winter." The loss in his voice was carefully contained, but unmistakable, a grief held close to his chest, like another kind of wound that refused to heal properly. Elise felt the weight of his tragedy settle between them, understanding now why he had risked his own safety to save strangers in the storm. In protecting her child, he was perhaps trying to balance some cosmic equation of loss and redemption, trying to restore something to a world that had taken so much from him. "I'm sorry," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The inadequacy of the words burned in her throat, but they were all she had to offer in the face of such loss. Tasunke nodded acknowledgement of her sympathy, then began breaking down their camp with military precision. "The past is carved in stone," he said, wrapping the buffalo robe with movements that spoke of countless similar mornings in countless temporary camps. "The future is still clay in our hands." They began their descent from the high country as the sun climbed toward its brief winter zenith, Tasunke leading his pony, while setting a pace that accommodated Elise's weakened condition. Every half-mile, he called a halt to check the baby's breathing and adjust the heated stones, his attention to detail revealing the depth of his commitment to their survival. The trail wound through forests of lodgepole pine and bare aspen, their branches etched against the sky like delicate calligraphy, written in a language only the mountains could read. Gradually, the snow gave way to frozen mud and scattered patches of brown grass, evidence that they were descending toward elevations where life could survive winter's assault without constant battle. "Where are we going?" Elise asked during one of their frequent rest stops, watching Tasunke scan the surrounding ridges with the systematic attention of a man who had learned that survival often depended on spotting trouble before it spotted him. "Willow Springs," he replied, his dark eyes never ceasing their careful sweep of potential hiding places and approach routes. Town's got a doctor supplies something that passes for law in these parts. I have business there debt to collect from a blacksmith named Morrison. What kind of debt? For the first time since she had met him, Tasunke's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish. The expression made him look younger, more approachable, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been in a more peaceful world. Honest work. Shoeing horses, repairing rifles, mending harness that's seen too much hard use. Morrison's good for the money, just slow to pay. In this country, a man's word is the only currency that truly matters. As they walked, Elise found herself studying her unlikely protector with growing fascination. There was something about the controlled way he moved, the constant alertness in his posture, that spoke of a warrior who had spent his life balanced on the knife's edge between hunter and hunted. She judged him to be perhaps a decade her senior, his face weathered by elements and hardship, but still undeniably handsome in the stark way of carved granite. The bullet scar on his left wrist was clearly old, the flesh long-healed, but still tender when he thought no one was looking. Whatever conflict had marked him, the war was still being fought in the hidden chambers of his heart, a battle between the desire for peace and the necessity of vigilance, in a world that showed no mercy to the unprepared. "My husband?" she said, eventually needing to fill the comfortable silence with something other than her own troubled thoughts. Talking helped pass the miles and kept her mind off the burning in her legs and the persistent ache in her back. He got himself entangled with Conrad Voss and the Quicksilver mine. Jack was never good with cards or money, but he thought he could gamble his way out of poverty. Tasunke's expression didn't change, but she sensed a subtle shift in the quality of his attention, as if the name Voss carried particular significance beyond its obvious importance in the local hierarchy of power and corruption. "Big man in these parts," he said carefully, his voice carrying an odd inflection that suggested personal knowledge rather than mere reputation. "Owns most of the mountain and half the men who work it. The other half just don't know they're owned yet." Jack started calling himself Whispering Fox around the freight camps last fall. Elise continued the words, coming easier now that she had begun. The admission brought a flush of shame to her cheeks, shame for her husband's pretensions, shame for her own gullibility in believing he might actually change. Thought it made him sound dangerous, like some kind of outlaw hero from a dime novel. Truth is, he couldn't whisper his way past a church social without getting caught in his own lies. The baby stirred against her chest, making small, contented sounds that warmed her heart despite everything else. Whatever Jack's failures as a husband, he had given her this perfect miracle before disappearing into his own weaknesses and fears. When I told him about the baby coming, he got scared. She admitted, her voice barely audible above the crunch of their footsteps in the crusted snow. Started drinking heavier, gambling with bigger stakes he couldn't afford to lose. Last I saw him was 3 days before Christmas, signing papers for Voss's foreman and talking about one final score that would solve all our problems forever. The memory brought fresh pain, not just for Jack's abandonment, but for the hope she had allowed herself to feel during those final, desperate days. She had actually believed he might find a way to make things right, that love for his unborn child might finally give him the strength to face his responsibilities. They crested a rise and saw Willow Springs spread below them in the valley's embrace, a collection of frame buildings and false fronts clustered around the railroad spur that connected the mines to distant markets. Smoke rose from chimneys scattered throughout the settlement, and the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber that made it look almost welcoming from this distance. But Elise had learned not to trust appearances in mining country. Voss's corruption would reach into every business, and backroom deal poisoning whatever it touched, like arsenic dissolved in a community water well. The Ash River ford lay directly in their path to town, its dark waters running swift and treacherous between banks of dirty ice. The current had carved deep channels that would be dangerous even in summer and winter, had added the extra hazard of concealed ice that could trap a horse's hoof or send an unwary traveler plunging into water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. Tasunke was testing the current's strength with a long pole, his movements deliberate and careful as he probed for solid footing when violence erupted from the willow thickets like a thunderclap in clear sky. The ambush had been carefully planned, with attackers positioned to block escape routes and catch their targets in the open, with nowhere to run. 3 riders burst from concealment with the coordinated precision of a cavalry charge, their horses' hooves throwing up sprays of mud and slush as they converged on the ford from different angles. But these weren't ordinary bandits looking for easy prey. Their coordination spoke of military training and official backing of men who answered to higher authority than their own greed. Deputy Oscar Tate led the assault, his pomaded hair gleaming in the afternoon light, as he aimed his mount directly at Elise and her child. Behind him rode Milan, a scarred mine guard, whose face bore the brutal map of too many fights, and young Felix, barely 20 years old, but carrying himself with the cocky assurance of someone who had never met consequences he couldn't shoot his way out of. "Mrs. Harden." Tate's voice cracked across the water like a whip, startling a flight of crows from the bare cottonwoods. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying and distorting until it seemed like a chorus of accusation. "By order of the territorial court, you and that child are hereby remanded to company custody pending satisfaction of outstanding debts." He brandished a folded document sealed with red wax, the paper crackling in the cold air with a sound like breaking bones. But even from horseback, Elise could see the seals were wrong, the ink too fresh, the parchment too clean. This was manufactured authority designed to intimidate rather than enforce legitimate law. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the baby closer, feeling his small body tense in response to her fear. The child might be only days old, but some instincts transcended experience, warning of danger even when the mind couldn't yet comprehend its nature. "I'm not chattel," Elise said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Neither is my son." The words came from some deeper place inside her, some wellspring of strength she hadn't known existed. Standing there beside the frozen river, with death approaching on horseback, she found herself thinking not of her own fear, but of the child in her arms, of the life he deserved to live, and the freedom that was his birthright. Tate's professional smile never wavered, but his pale eyes went winter hard, reflecting the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with a soul that had traded warmth for profit long ago. "That's for the company-appointed magistrate, not recognized by territorial law, to determine, ma'am. Now, you just come along peaceful-like, save everyone a heap of unnecessary trouble." He leaned from his saddle to grab her arm, his gloved hand reaching with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted without opposition. But Tasunke flowed into the space between them, with liquid grace, his powerful frame suddenly blocking the deputy's reach, like a mountain appearing where none had stood before. The warrior examined Tate's fraudulent document with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the fine print of broken treaties and false promises, his dark eyes moving methodically across the forged text, while his body remained coiled for instant action. Territorial seals are circular, not square. Tasunke observed his voice carrying the flat authority of absolute certainty. His finger traced the flawed wax impression with scholarly precision. This document also claims jurisdiction for Judge Hamilton, who died of consumption 3 weeks ago. The challenge was delivered calmly, but Elise could see the tension building in the deputy's postures. This wasn't going according to their plan, and desperate men made dangerous choices when their authority was questioned. Tate's hand dropped to the ivory-handled Colt at his hip, his fingers flexing with anticipation that made his horse dance nervously beneath him. "Don't recall asking for legal counsel from any savage." He snarled, the racial slur hanging in the air like cordite smoke. "This here's civilized business between white folks." The words hit Elise like a physical blow, revealing the ugly truth beneath the legal pretense. This wasn't about debt or law. It was about power and prejudice, about men who saw other human beings as property to be bought and sold. The insult struck Tasunke without visible effect, but Elise saw something subtle shift in his posture, a coiling of muscle, a predatory focus that transformed him from protector to weapon in the space between heartbeats. His weight moved onto the balls of his feet, hands floating near the knife at his belt, and the rifle slung across his back. "Fraud is fraud." Tasunke replied mildly, handing back the worthless paper with movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. Regardless of who points it out. What happened next shattered the winter stillness like breaking glass. Tate's Colt cleared leather with practiced speed, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that fell over the ford like a death shroud. Milan spurred his horse forward from the right, while Felix moved to block their retreat, the net tightening with military precision. But Tasunke had been reading the attack's development like a hunter reading tracks, and when violence finally erupted, he was ready. His movements seemed to bend the laws of physics. One moment he was standing peacefully beside Elise, the next he had grabbed Tate's gun wrist and used the man's own momentum to lever both rider and horse toward the icy river. The maneuver should have ended there, with Tate taking an unexpected bath and losing his weapon to the current. Instead, the deputy managed to twist in his saddle, using his legs to maintain his seat, while bringing the Colt around in a desperate arc. The weapon discharged with a roar that echoed off the canyon walls, the bullet whining past Elise's head, close enough to tear through the blanket wrapped around her baby. The near miss sent ice water through her veins as she realized how close death had come to claiming her child. The ragged hole in the fabric smoking from the bullet's passage would haunt her dreams for years to come. She found herself frozen, not with cold, but with the terrible understanding of how quickly everything could end. Tasunke's response was immediate and violent. His scarred left hand closed on Tate's wrist with crushing force, while his right drove upward in a short, brutal punch that connected with the deputy's jaw. Bone cracked audibly, and Tate's grip on his weapon loosened enough for Tasunke to tear it away and send it spinning into the creek. But Milan was already in motion, his cavalry saber clearing its scabbard with a distinctive ring of steel on steel. The blade caught the afternoon light as he drove his horse forward, aiming to take Tasunke in the back, while the warrior was engaged with Tate. The saber's point would have found its mark if not for Tasunke's battlefield instincts. Some inner sense warned him of the approaching threat, and he threw himself sideways just as the blade whispered through the space his body had occupied. The movement saved his life, but cost him his balance, sending him tumbling into the rocky shallows of the ford. Milan's follow-up stroke was perfectly timed, the heavy blade descending in an arc that would have split Tasunke's skull like a melon. Instead, it struck sparks from the stone where the warrior had been the impact, jarring Milan's arm and creating the opening Tasunke needed. From his position in the water, Tasunke grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it with devastating accuracy. The projectile caught Milan in the center of his forehead, stunning him long enough for Tasunke to surge upward and drag him from his saddle. The two men crashed into the creek in a tangle of limbs and weapons, and the icy water shocking them both to full alertness. Milan tried to bring his saber into play, but the confined space worked against him. Tasunke's knife flashed up from the sheath in his hand. In a blink, its keen edge finding the gap between Milan's ribs with surgical precision. The mine guard's scream was cut short as Tasunki's blade punched through his lung blood, frothing from his lips as he collapsed into the shallow water. The warrior rolled away from the dying man, but not quickly enough to avoid Felix's shot. The young gunman had finally overcome his initial shock and drawn his weapon, his first bullet creasing Tasunki's left shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. The wound was shallow, but agonizing blood streaming down his arm and staining the creek water pink. "Got you now, you red bastard!" Felix shouted, working his revolver's hammer for a second shot that would finish what the first had started. That was when Elise acted, though she would never be able to fully explain what drove her in that moment. The sight of Tasunke's blood, of the man who had saved them, being hurt while protecting her and her child, triggered something primal in her heart. She had never held a weapon more dangerous than a kitchen knife, but Milan's dropped saber lay within reach. The blade was heavier than she had expected, its weight nearly overbalancing her as she swung it in a clumsy arc toward Felix's horse. She had no hope of hitting the rider, but the animal reared in panic as the steel whistled past its head, unseating Felix and sending his second shot wild into the sky. The young man hit the ground hard, his revolver skittering away across the ice-slicked stones. He scrambled toward it on hands and knees, cursing creatively as he fought for the weapon that meant the difference between life and death. Tasunke reached it first, his longer arms giving him the advantage despite his wound. His foot came down on Felix's wrist with enough force to crack bone, pinning the young man's hand beneath his moccasin. "Yield." Tasunke commanded, his voice steady, despite the pain radiating from his shoulder. Blood continued to seep from the bullet crease, but the wound wasn't immediately life-threatening. Felix looked up at him with eyes wide with terror and growing understanding of his situation. Milan lay motionless in the creek, his blood turning the water crimson while Tate moaned softly from the bank, where he had crawled after Tasunke's punch had reorganized his facial bones. "I yield," Felix whispered, his voice barely audible above the creek's murmur. "Please don't kill me. I didn't want any of this." Tasunke studied him for a long moment, reading something in the young man's face that spoke of regret rather than mere fear. "Live better," he said, finally releasing the pressure on Felix's wrist. "Choose better. A man's choices make him what he is." The warrior retrieved the scattered weapons, checking each one methodically before tucking them into his belt. His movements were still fluid despite the blood loss, but Elise could see the strain beginning to tell in the tightness around his eyes. "We need to move," he said, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was soaked with blood, and she could see him favoring the arm. "More will come when these don't return." Elise helped him mount his pinto, her heart racing as she saw how much blood he had lost. The bullet had torn a furrow through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone and major vessels, but creating a wound that would weaken him with each passing hour. Their escape from the ford was a nightmare of slippery rocks and treacherous footing, complicated by Tasunke's injury and the baby's frightened crying. The child seemed to sense the violence that had erupted around him, his small body tense with fear that no amount of soothing could entirely calm. By the time they reached the shelter of the willow thickets, both adults were exhausted and the baby was inconsolable. They found a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging bank where they could rest and tend to Tasunke's wound. "Let me see," Elise said when they finally stopped, her hands already reaching for the torn fabric of Tasunke's shirt. She had helped Dr. Patterson back in Kansas deliver enough babies and treat enough injuries to know basic wound care, though she had never worked on a gunshot before. The bullet crease was ugly, but clean, the slug having passed through muscle without fragmenting or leaving debris behind. She tore strips from her petticoat and used creek water to clean the wound, ignoring Tasunke's sharp intake of breath when the cold liquid hit raw flesh. "Hold still," she commanded, surprised by the authority in her own voice. This was something she could do away to help the man who had already given so much for them. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the violence they had just witnessed, about the casual cruelty of men who would use force to claim human beings as property. As she bound the wound with makeshift bandages, she became acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment. Her hands on his bare skin, his trust in her inexperienced care, the vulnerability they both showed in this simple act of healing. Something shifted between them, a deepening of the bond that had begun when he first lifted her dying child from her arms. But alongside the growing connection, Elise felt the stirring of something else, a recognition that everything she had been taught about Indians, about the savage nature of the native peoples, had been a lie. Here was a man who had risked his life for strangers, who had shown more honor and compassion than any of the white men who claimed to represent civilization. "Thank you," Tasunke said when she finished rolling his shoulder experimentally to test the binding's tightness. Pain flickered across his features, but he made no complaint. "Thank you," she replied, meeting his dark eyes with newfound resolve. "For everything." They spent that night in a grove of bare cottonwoods, huddled together for warmth while the temperature dropped toward deadly levels. The baby nursed contentedly, despite the day's violence, his small body, a living furnace pressed between them. "You were brave today," Tasunke said as they shared the last of his jerky, his voice pitched low to avoid carrying in the still air. Elise shook her head, remembering the terror that had frozen her blood when the bullets started flying. "I was terrified." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he replied, adjusting the baby's position against his uninjured side. "It's acting despite the fear. You saved us both at the creek." The words warmed her more than the fire ever could, validation that she was becoming someone stronger than the abandoned woman who had nearly died in the blizzard. Change was happening within her, forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual dependence. Willow Springs revealed itself gradually as they approached through the river bottoms on February 18th. First, the church spire and mill wheel rising above the cottonwoods like promises of civilization. Then the false-fronted businesses lining Main Street like theater props awaiting their daily drama. The settlement buzzed with the controlled chaos of a community that had learned to balance legitimate commerce with the seamier necessities of frontier life. Freight wagons rumbled down the muddy streets, their loads covered by canvas tarps that concealed cargo ranging from mining equipment to contraband whiskey. Cowboys fresh from the high pastures mingled with miners still bearing the dust of the deep shafts, while painted ladies watched from second-story windows with the patient predatory grace of spiders in their webs. But underneath the surface bustle, Elise could sense something else, a tension that spoke of fear, carefully hidden of people going about their daily business, while constantly looking over their shoulders. This was a community under the thumb of power. She realized where the wrong word or gesture could bring swift and terrible consequences. Tasunke led them through the back alleys, his wounded arm cradled against his chest, but his eyes still alert for danger. His familiarity with the town's layout suggested previous visits conducted with the thoroughness of someone who planned for trouble before it found him. The Prairie Rose boarding house occupied a corner lot at 3rd and Cottonwood, its 2-story frame structure showing the weathered dignity of a building that had sheltered travelers through countless storms. Paint peeled from its clapboard siding in artistic patterns created by wind and weather, and the front steps sagged slightly under the weight of years. But warm light glowed behind clean windows, and smoke rose straight from its brick chimney. Beatrice Collins answered their knock with flour dusting her apron and wariness in her steel-gray eyes, but one look at the baby transformed her expression into something approaching maternal ferocity. She was a woman in her middle 40s, who had clearly weathered enough of life's storms to recognize genuine desperation when it appeared on her doorstep. "Lord, have mercy," She breathed, taking in Elise's exhausted condition, Tasunki's makeshift bandages, and the tiny bundle that had somehow survived everything the world had thrown at them. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions without the luxury of extended deliberation. "Get yourselves inside before you freeze to death on my porch." The boarding house's interior was simple, but scrupulously clean, furnished with solid oak pieces that had been crafted to last rather than impress. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the common room's center, and the aroma of baking bread filled the air with promises of comfort and civilization that seemed almost foreign after their days in the wilderness. "Anyone running from winter gets my fire," Beatrice declared, settling Elise in a ladder-backed chair beside the stove, while examining Tasunke's bandaged shoulder with professional efficiency. "Don't insult me by arguing about payment. There's some debts that can't be measured in silver or settled with coin." As she bustled around them, bringing hot coffee and checking the baby's condition, Beatrice kept up a steady stream of conversation that gradually revealed her own story. She had come west 15 years earlier with a husband who died in a mining accident, leaving her alone with nothing but determination and the boarding house as her means of survival. Learned early on that kindness is the only currency that multiplies when you spend it, she said, checking Tasunki's bandages with hands that had clearly tended wounds before. "Had my own share of dark nights when strangers took me in. Figure I owe the world a few good turns." Dr. Frederick Howell proved to be their first genuine ally when Tasunki's wound began showing signs of infection 2 days later. The town physician was a practical man in his late 50s who had learned to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance, their reputation, or the color of their skin. His office above Henderson's pharmacy was cramped, but scrupulously clean, equipped with medical instruments that spoke of genuine training rather than frontier quackery. "Clean wound, good binding," he observed as he rebandaged Tasunke's shoulder with proper medical supplies and antiseptic that made the warrior's jaw clench with pain. Whoever tended this knew what they were doing. His examination of the baby revealed continued improvement and the child's lungs clearing and his color improving with each passing day. "Remarkable constitution," Dr. Howell murmured as he listened to the infant's chest. "This boy was born to survive whatever the world throws at him." But it was on the evening of February 20th that Tasunke's condition took a turn for the worse. The wound had seemed to be healing properly, but infection set in with frightening speed, bringing with it a fever that left the warrior delirious and burning to the touch. "We need to cool him down," Dr. Howell said grimly as he examined his patient by lamplight. "The fever's too high. It'll cook his brain if we don't break it soon." Elise found herself thrust into the role of primary caregiver, sponging Tasunke's burning skin with cool water, while Beatrice helped manage the baby. In his delirium, the warrior spoke in Lakota, calling out names in a voice thick with anguish. "Mahpe," he whispered, his head thrashing on the pillow. "Winona, Tatanka Patesala." The names came like prayers or curses, and Elise realized she was hearing the voices of his ghosts, his brother, his sister-in-law, the nephew who would never grow up to receive his name. The fever had stripped away his careful control, revealing the depth of his grief and loss. "I'm here," she whispered, taking his hand in both of hers. "You're not alone." For 3 days and nights, she barely left his side, feeding him spoonfuls of broth when he was lucid enough to swallow, bathing his fevered skin and listening to the stories his delirium told. She learned about the winter camp at Crow Wing Creek, about the soldiers who came looking for excuses to drive the Lakota from their promised lands, about the man who had died trying to gather medicine for his pregnant wife. On the 4th night, as snow began falling outside the boarding house windows, Tasunke's fever finally broke. His eyes opened with clarity for the first time in days, focusing on Elise's face with something approaching wonder. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where else would I be?" She replied, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in her own voice. Somewhere during those long nights of tending him, something had shifted inside her. This was no longer just gratitude for a rescue. It was something deeper, more personal, more dangerous to acknowledge. It was Morrison, the blacksmith, who provided the breakthrough they desperately needed, approaching them on February 25th, with information that could change everything. The German immigrant's weathered face was grim as he gestured them into the back room of his shop, away from prying eyes and listening ears. "Your friend's husband," Morrison said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hiss of cooling metal. His accent was thick, but his English clear-shaped by years of dealing with customers from every walk of frontier life. "Jack Harden. He came to me 3 days before Christmas, scared out of his wits and talking like a man who knew death was hunting him." Morrison's massive hands, permanently stained with soot and scarred by hot metal, handled the envelope with surprising delicacy. "Said he'd been keeping copies of everything he'd seen in Voss's office, knew where more evidence was hidden. Gave me this letter with instructions to deliver it to his wife if he didn't return in 3 days. Also said he was planning to meet with someone in town, someone he trusted to help bring Voss down, but he never made it to that meeting." The blacksmith's eyes held the kind of anger that burned slow and steady. "I knew your Jack wasn't the man those wanted posters made him out to be. He was scared, yes, but not of getting caught. He was scared of what he'd learned, scared of what it meant for people like you and that baby." Inside the envelope was a map drawn on brown paper, marking a location near Ghost Creek, with meticulous attention to landmarks and distances that suggested multiple scouting trips to verify the hiding place. But it was the second document that made Elise's hands tremble, a marriage certificate witnessed by Ronan McKee, the Quicksilver mine foreman, proving beyond legal doubt that she was Jack's lawful wife, and therefore not subject to seizure as company property. "McKee," Dr. Howell said when they showed him the certificate later that day, his weathered face thoughtful as he examined the official seals and signatures. "Strange fellow, that one. Always asking odd questions about the mine's books, about shipping schedules and payroll discrepancies. Too many questions for a simple foreman, if you ask me." The physician lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Haven't seen him in town for over a week now. Word is that Voss has him locked up in the company office, but some folks think there's more to it than that. McKee always struck me as the kind of man who had business elsewhere, if you catch my meaning." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they revealed was more dangerous than any of them had imagined. If Jack had been gathering evidence against Voss, and if McKee had been asking the right questions, then the mine owner had more to hide than simple corruption. During the days that followed, as Tasunke recovered his strength and they planned their next move, Elise found herself observing the subtle signs of Voss's control over the community. She watched as shopkeepers changed their demeanor when company men entered their stores, saw the way miners hurried past the Quicksilver office with their eyes downcast, noticed how conversations died when certain names were mentioned. "It's like living under siege," Beatrice confided one evening as they prepared dinner. "Nobody says anything directly, but we all know what happens to people who cross Conrad Voss. They have accidents, or they disappear, or they find themselves run out of town with nothing but the clothes on their backs." The opportunity to reach Ghost Creek came on March 3rd, when another winter storm swept down from the Continental Divide with biblical fury. Snow fell in sheets that reduced visibility to arm's length, perfect cover for those who knew how to move without leaving tracks that could be followed. Tasunke's shoulder had healed enough for travel, though he still favored his left arm and moved with slightly less than his usual fluid grace. The wound had cost him some strength, but his determination remained undiminished. "This may be our only chance," he said as they prepared to leave. "Once the weather clears, Voss will have men watching every trail between here and the creek." "Stay close," he instructed as they slipped out of town through Morrison's back pasture in the pre-dawn darkness of March 4th. The snow fell around them like a living curtain, muffling sound and obscuring vision in ways that could be either blessing or curse, depending on who else might be moving through the white silence. "If we get separated, make for the old line cabin at Beaver Creek. I'll find you there." The ride to Ghost Creek tested every reserve of strength and determination Elise possessed. The baby, now nearly 3 weeks old, had grown stronger, but still required constant attention to keep him warm and fed in the brutal conditions. Tasunke navigated through the blizzard with preternatural skill, reading the land's subtle signs despite the whiteout conditions that would have left most travelers hopelessly lost. They reached their destination as the storm began to exhaust itself, revealing a landscape transformed into something from a fairy tale. Ghost Creek ran black and swift between banks of pristine snow, its voice singing with the accumulated wisdom of distant mountains. Ice formed delicate sculptures along the banks, and the surrounding pines wore mantles of white that made them look like ancient guardians, keeping eternal watch over hidden secrets. The cache lay exactly where Jack's map indicated, hidden beneath a boulder, marked with a distinctive vein of greenstone that caught the weak sunlight like captured fire. The hiding place had been chosen with care, protected from weather and casual discovery, while remaining accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look. What they found inside the oiled canvas wrapping exceeded even their worst fears about the scope of Voss's corruption. The documents painted a picture of systematic theft and violence that reached far beyond simple embezzlement. Payroll ledgers showed funds systematically diverted to private accounts in Denver and Kansas City. The theft so methodical, it could only have been planned over months or years. Shipping manifests revealed tons of silver ore sold through unofficial channels, the profits disappearing into personal coffers rather than company books. Letters between Voss and various territorial officials documented a web of bribery and influence peddling that reached into the highest levels of government. Most damning of all was a blood-stained letter from Voss to an associate in Denver, detailing plans to eliminate loose ends who might threaten the operation's security. Timothy Walsh's name was mentioned specifically, along with a coded reference to the Fox that could only mean Jack. Your husband was building a case that would have destroyed Voss completely. Tasunke observed his breath, misting in the cold air, as he examined the documents with professional appreciation for their thoroughness. No wonder they wanted him silenced. He was close to exposing everything. But their moment of discovery shattered like glass as rifle shots echoed across the frozen landscape, the sharp cracks multiplying as they bounced off canyon walls and snow-laden trees. Tate and reinforcements had found them emerging from concealment, with weapons ready and murder written clearly in their frost-reddened faces. The deputy marshal looked like a man pushed beyond all reason, his carefully maintained appearance replaced by the wild desperation of someone whose survival depended on completing this one crucial task. His badge caught the weak sunlight, but the authority it represented had been corrupted into something that served private interests rather than public justice. The battle that followed would be remembered in local folklore as the Ghost Creek Fight, though few witnesses survived to tell accurate versions of the story. The terrain favored defense with the rocky creek bed, providing cover, and the icy conditions making mounted charges treacherous for attackers. Tasunke used every advantage the ground offered, but his shoulder injury slowed him just enough to matter. When Tate finally cornered him behind a fallen log, the deputy's replacement Colt trained on his chest with deadly intent. It seemed that their desperate journey would end in failure and death. "Should have minded your own business, Redskin." Tate snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger with the satisfaction of a man about to complete a difficult job. Nothing personal, but you've caused me considerable inconvenience. That was when Elise acted, though she would never be able to fully explain what drove her in that moment. The documents had fallen during the fight, scattered across the ice, and in danger of being swept away by the creek's current. But more importantly, Tasunke was about to die protecting them, and she couldn't let that happen. The thought of losing him, of watching this man who had saved her and her child die because of her husband's legacy, triggered something primal in her heart. She had never fired a weapon in her life, but Felix's dropped rifle lay within reach of her position. Her hands shook as she worked the lever action, the mechanism stiff with cold and her own inexperience. The shot went wide, missing Tate entirely, but the sound was enough to make the deputy spin toward this new threat, with surprise written across his features. In that instant of distraction, Tasunke moved with the fluid grace of a natural warrior. His knife flashed up from the sheath in his hand. In a blink, the blade finding its mark between Tate's ribs with surgical precision. The deputy's eyes widened with shock and pain before he collapsed into the snow, his life's blood steaming in the frigid air. "The papers!" Elise shouted, scrambling toward the scattered documents as the creek threatened to carry them away. Her dress soaked through immediately as she plunged into the icy water. But she managed to retrieve most of the evidence before it could be lost forever to the current. They staggered back toward Willow Springs through the storm's aftermath, both wounded now, but carrying proof that could topple an empire built on corruption and violence. The return journey was a nightmare of exhaustion and pain. But they pressed on with the desperate knowledge that stopping meant death for all of them. The final confrontation came as they entered the outskirts of town on March 6th, not in the dramatic face-off they had expected, but in a desperate ambush in the narrow alley behind Henderson's general store. Voss's men had been watching for their return, and the attack came without warning or ceremony. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, bullets chipping brick and shattering windows, as Elise and Tasunke dove for cover behind an overturned wagon. The baby's terrified cries added to the chaos, his small voice nearly lost in the thunder of weapons and the shouts of desperate men. "Give up the papers!" Voss's voice echoed off the buildings, his cultured tones made harsh by desperation, and the knowledge that his empire was crumbling. This ends now one way or another. But surrender meant death, and they had come too far to quit now. Tasunke's rifle spoke once twice, driving their attackers back long enough for them to break cover and run toward Main Street. If they could reach the crowd, make their accusations public, they might survive long enough for the truth to matter. The running gunfight spilled onto the main thoroughfare, drawing curious onlookers, who quickly realized they were witnessing something more significant than a simple robbery or personal dispute. Elise found herself in the center of a growing crowd, the baby clutched to her chest, while Tasunke held their enemies at bay with disciplined rifle fire. "Listen to me," she shouted, her voice carrying over the gunfire with an authority she had never known she possessed. "Conrad Voss is a murderer and a thief. He killed my husband and Timothy Walsh to cover up his crimes." She held up the blood-stained documents, turning so the assembled crowd could see them clearly. The papers rustled in the cold wind, their importance obvious even to those who couldn't read the specific accusations they contained. "It's all here. Every stolen payroll, every life lost to his greed, every family cheated out of what they earned in the darkness of his mines. He's been robbing you all blind while you risked your lives to make him rich." The crowd's reaction was immediate and volcanic. Years of suppressed anger at Voss's excesses erupted in a roar of approval that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around them. Miners who had lost friends to unsafe conditions, shopkeepers who had been forced to pay protection, money families who had been cheated out of promised wages, all found their voices in a chorus of righteous fury that had been building for years. "She's right," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. I seen the books, they don't add up. My brother died in that cave-in because Voss wouldn't pay for proper supports. Another voice called out, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, sharing stories of corruption and abuse that had been whispered in shadows for too long. That was when Ronan McKee appeared, striding through the crowd with the confidence of a man who held all the winning cards in a game that others thought they understood. His appearance sent ripples of surprise through both camps. He was supposed to be Voss's prisoner, too drunk and beaten to interfere with whatever final solution the mine owner had planned. Instead, he moved forward with the bearing of someone who had been waiting for this moment, who had perhaps been planning for it longer than anyone realized. His face bore the marks of recent violence, but his eyes were clear and determined as mountain streams after rain. Actually, McKee announced in his thick Irish brogue, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, backed by federal law. Those documents belong to the United States Attorney General's office. I've been gathering evidence against this operation for the better part of 6 months. The revelation struck the assembled crowd, like lightning transforming understanding in the space between heartbeats. McKee wasn't just a mine foreman who had been corrupted or coerced. He was a federal investigator planted in Voss's organization to document the systematic corruption that had plagued the territory's mining industry. Ronan McKee, a special examiner attached to the U.S. Attorney for the territory, riding with deputy U.S. Marshals. He continued producing a badge and federal warrant from his coat pocket with a flourish that spoke of long-awaited vindication. The metallic gleam of official authority caught the afternoon light, transforming him from victim to prosecutor in the eyes of the watching crowd. Conrad Voss, you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, fraud upon federal revenues, and the murders of Timothy Walsh and Jackson Hardin. The crowd's roar of approval was deafening. Years of fear and resentment finally given voice and validation. But Voss had no intention of surrendering to face territorial justice, not when he still held weapons and men willing to use them on his behalf. The mine owner appeared at the crowd's edge like a specter of his former authority, his face twisted with fury and a nickel-plated derringer gleaming in his manicured hand. In the chaos of the moment, with armed men scattered throughout the crowd and emotions running higher than a spring flood, anything could happen. The nickel-plated derringer snapped toward the baby, toward Elise and her child, Voss's final desperate gambit to destroy the evidence and the witnesses who could condemn him. His eyes held the wild light of a man who had lost everything and was determined to take as many people with him as possible. But he had forgotten about Tasunke, who moved with the fluid grace of a natural warrior, despite his injuries and exhaustion. The rifle stock connected with Voss's temple with a sound like a melon being dropped on stone, and the mine owner crumpled to the muddy street, his empire of corruption collapsing with him into the dust and mire. The derringer spun away harmlessly into the crowd, its pearl handles catching the light one final time, before disappearing beneath the trampling feet of people who surged forward to see justice done at last. The aftermath of the Ghost Creek revelations settled over Willow Springs like sunrise after a long night, bringing with it a clarity that had been absent for years. Federal marshals arrived within the week to take custody of the prisoners and oversee the transition of mining operations to legitimate management that actually paid workers living wages and maintained safety standards worthy of human beings. The trials were swift but thorough, with evidence so overwhelming that even bought judges couldn't ignore the weight of testimony against the defendants. Voss received 20 years in federal prison, while his subordinates got lesser sentences in proportion to their involvement in the conspiracy that had corrupted an entire community. Dr. Howell treated the wounded, while Beatrice Collins fed the investigators, and Morrison shod their horses with special care that spoke of professional pride rather than mere business. The town was transforming corruption, giving way to something resembling justice, fear being replaced by hope for the first time in years. But for Elise, the most significant change was internal. The gradual realization that her ordeal had transformed her from a frightened, abandoned woman into someone capable of standing up to tyrants and protecting what mattered most. The baby thrived in the stable environment, his laughter beginning to ring through their quarters like silver bells announcing the arrival of spring. As the days passed and her child grew stronger, she found herself thinking often about Jack and the choice he had made in his final weeks. He had been weak, yes, and foolish in his gambling and drinking. But in the end, he had tried to do the right thing, had gathered the evidence that would ultimately bring down the man who had destroyed so many lives. He wasn't the man I thought I married, she confided to Beatrice one evening as they prepared dinner. But maybe he became the man he was meant to be in the end. As March gave way to April and the snows began their reluctant retreat from the high country, she sensed restlessness growing in Tasunki. The warrior had fulfilled his obligation to see justice done, but the wild country was calling to something deep in his soul, something that civilization could never fully satisfy. She caught him staring toward the northern mountains, with an expression that spoke of distant horizons, an untamed country of places where a man could live according to his own laws, rather than those imposed by others. The look in his eyes made her heart race with possibilities she had never dared to consider. The moment of truth came on a warm afternoon in mid-April, as they sat beside Mirror Lake, watching the baby explore the fascinating world of grass and wildflowers. Spring had arrived with a vengeance, painting the meadows with lupine and Indian paintbrush, while filling the air with the songs of birds returned from their southern exile. The baby, now nearly 2 months old, had begun crawling with determined purpose, his small hands and knees carrying him across the blanket, with the same methodical persistence his protector had shown in fighting their enemies. He laughed at a butterfly that landed on his tiny fist, the sound pure and innocent, in a way that made Elise's heart ache with love and fierce protectiveness. The marshals say they'll need testimony for a few more weeks, she said, not looking directly at Tasunke as she spoke. Her voice carried forced casualness that fooled neither of them. After that, I suppose you'll be heading back to your people. Tasunke was carving something from a piece of cedar, his scarred hands moving with the patient precision of someone who had learned that the most important things in life couldn't be rushed. Wood shavings curled away from his knife in delicate spirals, each cut purposeful and sure. My people are scattered to the 4 winds, he replied, without looking up from his work, his voice carrying the weight of loss that extended far beyond personal grief. Some on reservations, some hiding in the mountains, some trying to live like white men in towns that barely tolerate their presence. The old ways are dying, and the new ways haven't been born yet. So, where does that leave you? Now he did look at her, those dark eyes holding depths she was still learning to fathom. The carved cedar in his hands was taking shape intricate patterns that spoke of traditions older than written memory beauty, created not for profit, but for the simple joy of making something meaningful. Depends on whether there's something worth staying for, he said quietly, his voice carrying layers of meaning that made her pulse quicken. The baby chose that moment to crawl directly to Tasunke's moccasined feet, pulling himself upright, using the warrior's buckskin leggings for support. His tiny hands grasped at the cedar-carving dark eyes, bright with curiosity and absolute trust in the man who had saved his life. "What are you making?" Elise asked, her heart performing complicated acrobatics in her chest as she watched her son interact with the man who had become so much more than their protector. The sight of them together, warrior and child past and future, filled her with emotions she barely had words to express. Tasunke held up his work, a cradle board carved with intricate patterns and inlaid with a piece of greenstone that matched the marker from Jack's cache. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the product of countless hours of patient attention to detail that spoke of deep caring rather than mere obligation. Traditional Lakota, He explained, testing the wood's smoothness with his thumb, while the baby reached for the stone inlay with fascinated fingers. Every child needs something to carry them safely through the world. The greenstone represents protection and permanence, seemed appropriate for this little warrior who's already survived more than most men see in a lifetime. Inside the cradleboard's bindings, Elise found one final gift from her husband's hidden cache, a birth certificate issued by the territorial registrar in Denver, officially documenting her son's legitimacy and citizenship. The document was properly stamped and witnessed legal proof that would protect the child from any future complications or challenges to his identity. "You're giving me everything I need to leave," she said softly, running her fingers along the cradleboard's polished edges while her voice threatened to break with emotion. "Making sure we have no obligations to hold us here, no debts that can't be repaid." Tasunke set down his carving tools and met her gaze directly, his expression serious but not unkind. The afternoon light caught the planes of his face, highlighting the strength and gentleness that had carried them through their darkest hours. "I'm giving you choices," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Something women don't get nearly enough of in this territory or any other." The baby gurgled happily as he explored the cradleboard's leather bindings, his tiny fingers testing every texture and surface within reach. Watching him, Elise felt the weight of infinite possibility, balanced against harsh reality, the collision of dreams with the practical limitations of their world. What future could there be for a Lakota warrior and a white woman with a child in the Colorado Territory of 1878? The very idea would be scandalous enough to destroy them all, socially might even be dangerous to their physical safety. And yet, she had seen this man risk everything repeatedly for strangers, had felt the strength of his protection through the darkest nights, had watched him choose mercy over vengeance and justice over profit. If that wasn't love, practical, grounded, tested by fire and forged in the crucible of shared hardship, then what was, "There's good country north of here"? Tasunke said quietly, his eyes fixed on horizons she couldn't see, but somehow felt in her heart. Clean streams full of trout, plenty of game, wide valleys where a man can raise horses and children without looking over his shoulder every sunrise. It's also a long way from doctors and schools and churches. Elise pointed out her practical nature, warring with the dreams he was painting with his careful words. A long way from everything civilized. True enough. He acknowledged a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But it leads towards something else, a chance to build something new instead of just surviving what already exists. A place where what matters is how you treat people, not what color their skin happens to be or what mistakes their fathers made. The baby had fallen asleep against Tasunke's chest, his small body completely relaxed in absolute trust. The sight of them together, warrior and child protector, and protected, sent a surge of emotion through Elise's heart that left her momentarily breathless with its intensity. "What exactly are you asking me?" She said, though she already knew the answer and felt her heart racing with the implications. Tasunke's scarred hand covered hers where it rested on the blanket, his touch gentle but sure as mountain granite. The contact sent warmth up her arm and into her chest, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. "I'm asking if you trust me with more than just your survival," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his dark eyes. "I'm asking if you have the courage to build something new, knowing it won't be easy, but believing it will be worth every hardship we face together." The weight of decision settled on her shoulders, but for the first time in months, it felt manageable rather than crushing. She had spent too long being acted upon by others, abandoned by her husband, threatened by Voss, rescued by Tasunke. Perhaps it was finally time to make a choice, purely for herself and her son. But it was more than just choice. It was recognition of something that had been growing between them since that first night in the blizzard. She had fallen in love with this man, not despite his differences, but because of his fundamental goodness, his strength tempered by gentleness, his honor that transcended the petty prejudices of their time. "I believe," she said simply, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that felt like signing a contract with destiny itself. "I believe in you, and I believe in us. But more than that, I believe in myself now, in what we can build together." "And what about the rest of the world?" she asked, needing to voice the practical concerns that couldn't be ignored. "What happens when they see what we are to each other? Let them look." Tasunke replied, his voice carrying quiet conviction that brooked no argument. "We've faced worse than gossip and lived to tell about it. Besides, where we're going, there won't be many people whose opinions matter more than our own." That evening, as the sun settled behind the continental divide and painted the sky in shades of rose and burnished gold, they made their preparations for a journey that would take them far from the familiar landmarks of their separate pasts. Tasunke had horses and supplies knowledge of the country, and skills honed by generations of ancestors who had survived in hostile territory. Elise had legal documents proving her freedom medical knowledge learned from Dr. Howell, and a growing confidence in her own capabilities. Most importantly, they had each other and the child who had brought them together through the mysterious alchemy of mutual protection and shared hardship. The people of Willow Springs gathered to see them off on the morning of April 20th, 1878. Dr. Howell provided a complete medical kit and detailed instructions for treating common ailments in the absence of professional help. His handshake with Tasunke lasted longer than mere politeness, required a gesture of respect between men who had faced hard choices and made the right ones. "You take care of that boy," he said, ruffling the baby's hair with gentle fingers. "He's going to do great things someday. Mark my words." Beatrice Collins packed enough food for a week's travel, her eyes suspiciously bright as she hugged Elise goodbye and whispered fierce blessings for their journey. "You write when you get settled," she commanded, pressing letters of introduction into Elise's hands. "There's good people everywhere if you know how to find them, and you'll need friends where you're going." Even Morrison the blacksmith contributed, shoeing their horses with special care and refusing any payment beyond the promise that they would remember his friendship in whatever new home they built. "You find that good country," he told Tasunke, gripping the warrior's hand in his powerful blacksmith's clasp. "You build something worth the building, something that will last." They rode north toward the Medicine Bow Mountains. As the morning mist lifted from the valleys, three souls bound together by circumstances that would have destroyed weaker spirits. Behind them lay the civilized world with all its comforts and constraints, its prejudices and predetermined paths that would never have room for what they had become. Ahead stretched unknown territory, where they would write their own rules and create their own definitions of family and home, where love would be measured not by social convention, but by the daily choices of protection, sacrifice, and shared dreams. The baby rode secure in his new cradleboard, dark eyes taking in the endless procession of mountains and meadows with the calm acceptance of someone who had never known a world without adventure. Occasionally, he would reach up to touch Tasunke's face or grasp at Elise's hair, claiming them both with the casual possessiveness of childhood that recognizes love regardless of social convention. As they climbed toward the high country, Elise found herself thinking not of what they were leaving behind, but of what they were riding toward. Somewhere ahead lay the valley Tasunke had described, a place with sweet water and rich grass shelter. from the worst weather and room for dreams to take root and flourish like wildflowers after rain. It would not be an easy life, she knew. There would be harsh winters and lean times isolation, and the constant awareness that they were building something the outside world might never accept or understand. But it would be their life, shaped by their own choices and sustained by love, that had been forged in desperate circumstances and proven stronger than fear, prejudice, or conventional wisdom. The snow began falling again as they reached the timberline, gentle flakes that caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds. But this time, Elise felt no fear of what the weather might bring. She had learned that survival was not just about enduring what life dealt you, it was about finding the courage to reach for something better, even when the odds seemed impossible. Especially then. As the sun set behind the western peaks and they made camp in a sheltered grove of ancient pines, Elise nursed her son, while Tasunke built their fire and prepared their simple meal. The familiar routine had become precious to her, not just because it represented safety, but because it represented choice and commitment, the daily decision to build a life together, one moment at a time. The baby finished nursing and fell asleep in her arms, his breathing deep and regular in the thin mountain air. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, brilliant points of light in the vast darkness of the frontier night. "Any regrets?" Tasunke asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pine needles. Elise looked at the child, sleeping peacefully in her arms, at the man beside her, whose strength had become her anchor and whose love had become her home, at the endless country spreading out beyond their small circle of firelight. Somewhere out there lay the valley of their dreams, the place where they would build their future, one sunrise at a time. "None," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Not a single one. The fire crackled and sparked, sending embers spiraling up toward the star-filled sky like prayers made visible. In the morning, they would continue their journey toward whatever tomorrow might bring. But tonight, wrapped in buffalo robes and each other's presence, they were already home. The baby stirred in his sleep, one tiny hand, reaching out to grasp both their fingers simultaneously, binding them together in a circle of warmth and promise that no earthly power could break. In that simple gesture lay all the future they would ever need. Not perfect, perhaps, but theirs to shape according to the dictates of their own hearts. And in the wilderness of the Colorado Territory, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that was miracle enough for any lifetime.